battery off here. Go to Phoenix 1.
And then I'm going to bring them back in to present their ideas, and then we'll talk about them after. So first, Cory Doctorow, esteemed author, journalist, blogger, activist. You wear so many hats. Cory, do you mind just doing a quick 30-second introduction of yourself?
Sure. I'm Cory Doctorow. I'm mostly a science fiction writer. I'm told that I'm allowed to do this. I have a new book out in a week called Attack Surface, the third little brother book. I work with the Electronic Frontier Foundation and have done for 20 years. My current role is special consultant. Mostly I work on issues related to competition and interoperability. I'm a visiting professor of library science at UNC, a visiting professor of computer science at Open University. I write a daily website called pluralistic.net, and I'm an MIT Media Lab research affiliate.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Nina, why don't you introduce yourself next?
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Nina Jankowicz, and I have the strange and funny title of Disinformation Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My work there focuses on tech regulation as well as comparative approaches to countering disinformation. My own background is in Central and Eastern Europe. I spent a year in Ukraine advising the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there on how to counter disinformation. And I have a book just out in July called How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. Great to be with you.
Great to have you. And oh my gosh, I feel like I'm lazy for not having a book, guys. Jay Rosen, why don't you introduce yourself next?
Thank you, Sarah. I teach journalism at NYU. I've been doing that since 1986. And I have two primary interests. One is I study the digital transformation of the press and what it's doing to public service journalism. I have a graduate program called Studio 20, which is focused on innovation in journalism. And then in my other life, I'm also a press critic. I write a lot about coverage of politics. Lately, that's been a lot about Trump in the press. And I practice my criticism both on social media, on Twitter, where I do a lot of writing as a kind of public outreach or extension of journalism school. And I've had my blog, pressthink.org, since 2003. Good to be here.
So great to have you. If you don't follow Jay Rosen on Twitter, you are missing out. And I will say I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with Jay's students who give me so much hope for the future of internet. So with that, I wanted to just get started and have each one of our panelists sort of walk through in just about 5 minutes what your big idea is to fix the internet. So let's go in the same order that we did introductions. Cory, let's have you go first.
Sure. So I, like Tom Eastman wrote on Twitter, I am old enough to remember when the web wasn't just 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And we have a lot of different explanations for how the web got so concentrated. One of the big ones is that there's something about network effects combined with machine learning that just hands absolute dominance to these firms, and that also allows them to exercise this outsized role in our discourse by manipulating us. I think the thumbnail version of that is like Google invented a mind control ray to sell you fidget spinners, and then Robert Mercer stole it and made your uncle racist. And I'm really skeptical of this account, not least because when you look closely at how these companies grew, you find that they grew by the tried and true tactics of mediocre sociopathic monopolists since the rail barons. They just bought other companies or crushed their competition using anti-competitive tactics. I mean, Google is a company that has made between 1 and 2.5 products, a search engine that we all love and a pretty good Hotmail clone. And maybe they did Android, maybe the team they bought in wasn't really It hadn't really made Android yet. But everything else is just a product they bought and then either ran into the ground or managed to make successful. And everything they've done internally has been unsuccessful, except for their own operational technology. And it raises this question: what is it that changed that allowed Google and these other firms to remain dominant while the firms of yesteryear, like HP or Compaq or Dell, went under? And I think the answer is that we just stopped enforcing antitrust law. And so we let these companies grow. And then as they grew, they managed to create barriers to the interoperability that was so key to overturning dominance before. That when you look at how, say, Microsoft grew, they grew by making an operating system that ran on a bunch of different hardware that IBM was not willing to make their own OS for because they were worried about antitrust enforcement. When you look at how Apple saved itself in the Office, they did so by cloning Microsoft's Office formats with the iWork suite. When you look at how Facebook grew in the presence of MySpace, they made a bot that would log into MySpace pretending to be you and get your waiting MySpace messages and put them in your Facebook inbox, so you didn't have to choose between the superior interface of Facebook and the MySpace, which had all your friends held hostage. And in those worlds, those walled gardens become kind of feeding pens for new nimble predators, right? That you have new market entrants that come in and say, oh, look, you've conveniently organized all my customers. I'll just have those then. And the thing that's changed since then is that all of those companies have successfully for new laws and new interpretations of laws and new regulations that make it illegal to do to them what they did to their previous customers. And I think restoring the right of new market entrants to modify existing products and services to serve their customers better is an incomplete but significant part of how we have managed to avoid this network effect lock-in in times gone by. And the way that we get there is by weakening the power of the big companies, not just in tech, but in every industry, so that they have a harder time distorting our policy.
And I know we are going really fast, but I just want you to very quickly catch the audience up for people who are not as familiar with antitrust policy. We had a big House report come out yesterday on antitrust. Any big takeaways from it?
Well, it's a mixed bag. There's some really good stuff. There's like, let's just restore the old rules that we had for antitrust before Robert Bork became Ronald Reagan's court sorcerer and said we couldn't enforce antitrust law anymore unless there was a consumer harm, unless prices were going up. So now they're saying, let's go back to what we used to do before Reagan, right? Where companies that are big and buy other companies are subjected to scrutiny. Companies that are big and merge with their major competitors are blocked. Companies that create vertical monopolies are forced to divest and have what's called structural separation. And then there's some stuff that's going to be way harder to enforce, right? Like, so there's this idea that there should be algorithmic or search neutrality. So Google shouldn't be able to preference its own products over its competitors' products and search results, which sounds really simple until you ask yourself, who determines what a neutral outcome is, right? The idea that Google has built a webcam that they've stuck in Plato's cave that can tell you what the objectively best result is on the top of search results is as wrong as the idea that Google has made a mind control ray. Anyone who ever claimed to be able to algorithmically compute objective truth is a fraud, just like anyone who's ever claimed to be able to change people's minds with machine learning. You know, Rasputin was a fraud, MK Ultra was a fraud, pickup artists are frauds, and the people who claim that they can change our minds with machine learning are also either self-deluded or tricking us.
Okay, thank you so much. I just wanted to get a quick wrap of what that happened yesterday because it's so pivotal to this conversation. Nina, we're going to go to you next. Thoughts on what big idea you would bring to fix the internet?
So I think the big idea that I have is that foreign disinformation and domestic disinformation need to be treated the same way. It's been 4 years since Russia interfered in the 2016 election. And since then, our information environment has only become more polluted. We've done very little to stop Russia. And now we've got China, Iran, Venezuela also playing the game, not to mention fringe media on both sides of the political spectrum that are using the very same tactics that our foreign adversaries use in order to affect the information environment. And on top of that, of course, we've got the political disinformation coming from our elected officials, including the president himself. And over the past couple of months throughout 2020, but especially during the coronavirus crisis, we've been slammed with disinformation about not only COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter protests, but more recently, forest fires, mail-in voting. And I think the point that I try to make in my book is that this isn't a new problem. A lot of countries have been dealing with this and actively trying to, reverse the degradation of the democratic information environment for over a decade. And their experience says that it takes all of us, not just government, not just the social media platforms, not just, the media ecosystem. It takes all of us to reverse that. And so one of the main points that I make, and something that I really didn't even think was going to come out when I started out researching this book about Russian information warfare, is that if we have governments that claim to fight disinformation originating outside of our borders, we cannot fight them and effectively do so when we are, we are our own purveyors of disinformation. And again, that comes back to my big idea. We need to treat these two things the same way. So we could sanction Russia to Timbuktu and back. The social media platforms could hermetically seal our information environment and start playing whack-a-troll even more aggressively. Just yesterday, we saw this big QAnon takedown on Facebook and Instagram. But until we recognize how disinformation works, that is that it, uses the fissures in our society, weaponizes those fissures in order to pit us against one another and traffic in outrage and emotion, we're going to continue to be on the back foot. So in the case studies that I look at in my book, places like Estonia, the Republic of Georgia, Poland, Czech Republic, Ukraine, the folks that are doing a good job and kind of making progress against this problem, both from Russia and from their own domestic sources of disinformation, are really investing in building societal resilience. And what does that mean? Of course, there are things like media literacy, digital literacy that they're investing in, but it's not just at the school level. Often we think about K through 12 programs. I want us to focus on voting age populations now. If you look at the polling, the folks who need help navigating today's information environment are actually older people who are used to having content curated for them to a certain degree. So how do we reach those people? Professional development programs are one way. I think social media platforms have a role to play, and so far they've been pretty tepid about that role. And also public libraries are a great vector to deliver this sort of training. They're still highly trusted in society. We trust public institutions that we have left. And that's something that we've seen used in places like Ukraine to great effect. But we also need to invest in public media. I think if you look at the resilient societies in other places in the world, especially places like Finland, Sweden, they've all got a really robust public media ecosystem that is not only trusted, but fills the information void. A lot of what we're seeing, especially during this election cycle, both from foreign and domestic disinformers, is the fake local news website that is meant to fill that informational void and that lens, the local news lens for many people. So we've got to really be pumping money into the public media ecosystem to fill up those news deserts. I think that's critical. And then finally, we really need to hold our public officials accountable for understanding that disinformation and the degradation of our information ecosystem is not a partisan issue. This is a democratic issue, small d, not large d, right? It affects all of us. It affects our ability to participate in democracy. And until we recognize that and hold those leaders accountable, we're going to continue to see the information ecosystem degrading. And frankly, we're going to continue to lose the information war. So I think we need to invest in these generational solutions sooner rather than later. We have squandered precious time over the past 4 years politicizing this issue. And that's been clear over the last couple of weeks with the news coming out as we head toward November 3rd.
That's all such great points. I think especially the concept of recognizing domestic actors in misinformation has been more prevalent this cycle than last. I want to bring Jay Rosen in to hear about some of his ideas. Jay, I'm also curious to hear your reflection on Nina's point about investing in public media, but I'll let you take the stage first to talk about your idea.
Okay, I have a brief presentation. It might take a little longer than 5 minutes, but I'll go fast. And it very much relates to what Nina just said. The starting point for my talk today is a pretty obvious problem. Nina talked about it. The entire news system is designed for daily content production, not designed in any way for public understanding. I have an idea for a modest improvement that I'm going to describe in this short talk. I'm not sure it's a big idea, but it's a small thing that can be done about a big problem. Next slide, please. That's not the next slide. That's not it either. Next, after that. Okay, so here's a bizarre little headline that came across my social feed on September 21st. It says that the Department of Justice has designated New York City an anarchist jurisdiction. The local news station WNBC picked it up. It has a helpful image of an exploding police car that was actually taken from several months before, just to add to the feel of anarchists taking over the world, which is ironically juxtaposed to people in Central Park hanging out. But this was an actual thing that happened. The Department of Justice tried to call New York City an anarchist jurisdiction. You might say that it's kind of a silly example of information overload, except for one thing. Next slide, please. That's a pretty good example of what Steve Bannon told the author Michael Lewis in February of 2018 in a quote that's become kind of famous. Steve Bannon said, "The Democrats don't matter." In other words, political opposition isn't how we're going to govern. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. I don't consider Bannon a very intelligent man, but this was an insightful description of Trump's propaganda method, which works by overwhelming us, flooding the zone, making it impossible for anyone else to be heard. Next slide, please. As Nina indicated, this has become known as the Russian style of propaganda, the Firehose of Falsehood, it's sometimes called. Here are some characteristics of it. It's high volume, multi-channel, shameless in its willingness to distribute untruths, often mixed with a few specks of truth to add to the confusion. There's no commitment to, requirement for consistency across messages. You can contradict yourself endlessly. Rapid, continuous, repetitive in its messaging. The point of this fire hose is not to persuade people, but to confuse and overwhelm them, dishearten them. It both assumes a low trust environment and lowers trust further in the belief that as trust evaporates, powerful people will have the advantage. The number of arguments you put out matters more than their quality, in part because you're just trying to overwhelm people, but also because the coalitions that emerge from this method are people who don't necessarily agree with each other on everything, but there's one thing they feel very strongly about, and that's what binds them to the leader. And of course, the purpose is to drown out competing messages just through sheer volume. Next slide, please. We're living in a civic emergency. I think all of us know this intuitively. Our newsrooms, though, are built on daily routines that have not adapted well to information abundance. There is currently no way to stop the endless flood of daily content production by the news system and switch to any kind of emergency setting in news. The news system doesn't have an emergency setting. It can't switch modes, as it were. Next slide. And that's why I'm introducing the concept of urgency index. This is a simple way of beginning to address what I just described. It's a dead simple newsroom product. It would live online. It'd have a URL. It could also be a newsletter or a phone alert. And it's a simple list of threats and problems that are in the news, not necessarily because they're new today. Rather, they're ranked by how urgent they are to the public you address, to the community that you're trying to inform. In my imagination of it, it would be remade weekly or more often if something important happened. And you rank each story by a combination of how consequential it is, the likelihood of the threat happening and the imminence or a nearness of it to our lives. You put those three together, and that's what creates the urgency ranking. Next slide, please. This is my simple sketch of it. You can see why I'm a writer and not an illustrator from this, but it has 5 big possible threats and dangerous problems listed there with a short description of each one, links to know more or to learn about what we can do about it, and you can tell what its ranking was the previous week, and that's the entire idea. I mocked it up as a product of Time magazine, but it could be, of course, any news site. Next slide, please. This is what you need to create an individual entry in the urgency index. You need a headline. This is from April, how I imagine it might happen in April of this year. The headline could be, "Where are the tests?" referring to the problem of testing in COVID. A short description of why it's so critical that we get more tests. A couple of links for people to learn more about it. You just do that 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 times, and you have your urgency index. That's what I mean by a modest improvement. It's a very simple method. Next slide, please. Here are some of the benefits and purposes. It's noise reduction. You can finish it. It's not a doom scroll. It's the antidote to the doom scroll. It introduces some hierarchy into a flood of news. It's not what matters today or will matter one day, but it's trying to register persistent importance day to day, week to week. When, for example, it was really important for us to start testing for COVID, that didn't disappear the day after it was big news. It was true persistently over time. It creates something that forces the newsroom to think a little bit differently, not daily, but currency. It doubles as a priority list for your assignment desk, especially the production of explainers. And when new threats make it onto the index, that itself is a kind of event worthy of an alert. Next slide, please. A related recommendation that I've also written about is the big national newsrooms need threat modeling teams. Threat modeling is a discipline in IT and computer security, in counterterrorism, in public health, and it tries to anticipate what could be a threat. Similar to the way each newsroom has their own polling unit, each newsroom needs its own threat modeling team, which would be a mix of experts, editors, and beat reporters with expertise. The job is to try and game out what could happen next, especially, for example, in anticipation of the November election, which allows you, instead of just reacting to the latest explosion of news, to anticipate where the news is going. Part of it is scanning for weak signals, things that are just starting now that are possibly going to get way bigger, like the eruption of a new virus in Wuhan. And the product of the threat modeling team could be the urgency index as I've described it. Next slide, please.
All right, Jay, we have just a minute left. Perfect.
That's the last slide. The old front page system was a hierarchy of what's new today, not of what's true today, or better yet, what's still true, even though it was news 2 days ago or 2 weeks ago. So that's why I proposed the urgency index as an answer to the question, what in the daily flood of occurrences should I treat as most important, most disruptive? Thank you for your attention.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Cory. Jay, for my first question, I wanted to come back to you. At Axios, we have a daily newsletter where we do rank stories 1 through 10 for a similar reason that you described. It allows the reader to actually complete something so you're not doom scrolling, and it forces us to create some sort of hierarchy. I can concede that we might prioritize what's new in some cases as opposed to an urgency threat, but I also think it's something we do deeply consider. So my question is, Do you worry that potentially we're saying with this urgency scale that that's something that news companies aren't already considering at the time, or do you think it's just a problem that most news companies don't?
I think the problem is most companies don't do this. Axios is a little bit better at it. They don't do it at all. And the other problem is that news companies favor dailiness. They favor what's new today, not what's true today, as I've tried to say in my conclusion. And the bias towards dailiness is because of commercial incentives. It's also the rhythm of a newsroom. It's also one reason people go into journalism is they like that they can get their assignment, do their story, turn it in, it runs online, it's published, and then the next day you do something different. That's not a bug, that's a feature for most journalists. And so I think the dailiness bias is cooperating with the flood the zone with shit method. And that's what I tried to intervene in with this modest improvement.
And that dailiness bias. So I like that Nina addressed some of the commercial incentives here. Maybe we should be investing more in public media. But how do we get rid of the dailiness bias in people?
Well, by creating products that respond to, excuse the cliche, information overload and fatigue, news fatigue, and cynicism that is generated by those overloads. Those are themselves public needs, but they're also buckets of demand that I don't think the news system is really responding to. Even though it sounds like an old idea, the news system is not very good at reducing information to the things that you really need. It thinks it is, but it's not being effective at that.
That is a very good point. I agree. I want to go both to Nina and to Cory to talk about this commercial incentive. So, Nina, you addressed some sort of a regulatory framework where we would introduce more publicly funded media. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I'm not even sure we need to introduce more publicly funded media. I strongly believe in, the efficacy of PBS and NPR. I think they're doing really important work right now. Some of my colleagues, for instance, Karen Kornblue at the German Marshall Fund, have suggested that we need a sort of public interest model for the internet, and I think that's worth exploring. But I also think, in addition to the incentives on the media side, we need to disincentivize the type of information that is becoming getting so much traction on social media. The most engaging content is the most enraging content. And I think there's a couple ways to do that. Obviously, regulatory oversight and transparency will help a lot with that, giving people the tools they need to understand why they're being targeted with certain content, why certain content is appearing in their feeds over and over when, they haven't seen a post from their actual best friend on Facebook in several weeks. That stuff is really important, and so many people don't get that. But also training people in emotional manipulation. That's what really came up during Jay's most recent remarks for me. Some of the media literacy curriculum that I think is most effective isn't actually about teaching people how the media ecosystem works. It's about learning to recognize the responses in yourself when you're being emotionally targeted and manipulated, and understanding then what your response should be. Understanding, that perhaps I should figure out what this person's or this entity's interest is in targeting me with this information, and maybe think a little bit before I share. I think we can really develop the reflexes that we need for this new ecosystem of flooding the zone with shit that we don't have yet, frankly, because we all know, if we get a call from somebody asking for our social security number, or if we get an email from a Nigerian prince offering us $1 million, we know not to trust those things. We need to develop those same reflexes for this new era of the firehose of falsehoods.
I totally agree with that. I think most Americans are attuned when they see a phone number that looks exactly like theirs to assume that it's spam trying to manipulate them. So that gives me hope that that's possible. Cory, let's go to you on this regulatory structure. My question is, do you think we're ever going to get to a point or our lawmakers are going to take this seriously, come together in a nonpartisan fashion, and regulate these companies in a meaningful way. And I ask because before the House antitrust report was released, we had conservatives on the committee leaking what they think should be said that wasn't said in the report. And it made me feel like this report can't even be that effective because clearly it's not even coming out in a totally nonpartisan way.
Is like, why do we get bad policy? And where does bad policy come from? And I think it ties very closely into the points that Nina made about the plausibility of conspiracy and why people are willing to believe these things. So, I mean, if I'm going to go as quick as I can, but to give you a good answer, I want to start by saying that our era is very technologically complicated. And we are not going to have the news media or any other institution give us the means by which we can evaluate every decision that is a life or death decision for us, right? You even if you master the food hygiene stuff you need not to die from contaminated dinner, you then have to do it again for the 737 MAX to figure out whether it's safe to fly in, and again for aerosol particles, and again for whether your kid's distance education curriculum is any good, and so on and so on. What we have instead of expecting everyone to do the research and understand it for themselves is an allegedly legible process, a fair process by which we come to good conclusions about technical issues of moment. And to answer your question, we can do it, right? The fact that you're not dead of listeria or cholera is proof that sometimes lawmakers who have no domain experience, right? Show me the cohort of microbiologists in Congress who are making this policy. They have no domain experience, can nevertheless create a framework for a process that produces good evidence-led technical outcomes. And the reason we don't get those good evidence-led technical outcomes is that when industries are concentrated, they have, on the one hand, excess capital from monopoly rents, and on the other hand, a small enough group of executives that they can collaborate on a single set of policy goals. So we look at all the tech executives with Trump at the top of Trump Tower in 2016, and we say, why are they all meeting with Trump? Fair question, but better question, how do they all fit around one table? Right? If you can all fit around one table, then you can distort policy. And so the lack of pluralism is at the root here. And media literacy, I don't think, is going to solve it. As Dana Boyd has pointed out, conspiracy is weaponized media literacy, right? Conspiracy is consider the source, right? When anti-vaxxers gather, they are not ignorant, they're lavishly wrong, right? They know an awful lot about how the Sacklers made more money than the Rockefellers, collaborating with corrupt officials in health ministries and departments to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans with opioids. And they say, well, how can you trust the pharma industry when it kills people with impunity and its regulators are in bed with it? And that's the thing that gives it the air of plausibility. Put out the fires of wrong beliefs, but we have to clear the brush that makes the wrong beliefs so ignitable. And I think that we tinker in the margins when we talk about changing what people believe. And I think that we get at the root when we talk about our epistemology, how we know things are true. And what we need are institutions that we can trust. And there has been a 40-year project to convince us that government institutions aren't trustworthy. And that 40-year project was accompanied by elected officials whose victory condition was to make the government bad at its job, because that's what they campaigned on.
What is the
sorry,
company?
say again?
What is the company?
What is the...
You said there's a 40-year company?
A 40-year campaign, I beg your pardon. 40-year campaign. You know, the Reaganite doctrine that the, most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, and that governments can't do anything, is accompanied by bad governance, which makes the point that government can't do anything. And we have a bunch of people who are really convinced that they can't trust government agencies. And in part, they're convinced because government agencies are captured by the people that they regulate, that we have revolving doors between cable and the FCC, between tech and the FTC and the White House Office of Technology Policy, between all of the industries that are meant to be regulated and the entities that are supposed to be regulating them. And to throw it to media literacy and expertise and say, well, if you want to know whether the amount of lead in your water is safe, just go get a pediatric neurology degree and then learn how to do chemical assays of your water, is a counsel of despair. what we need to do is we need to have institutions that deliver us reliable outcomes and that have a process for revisiting those outcomes in light of new evidence.
Quick question for you.
Can I jump in really quickly? I don't believe that media literacy is a panacea, but I think it has been sorely ignored in this country right now. And we absolutely need a regulatory solution. I agree with you 100% there. But the fact that this has become a partisan issue, something that is just essentially equipping people with the tools they need to make decisions in this democracy is the alarm bell that I've been trying to sound for 4 years. And I used to get laughed out of the room when I brought up media literacy. But it also has to do with civics. You're absolutely right. What you were talking about in terms of trust in government, that's civic issue also. And so all of that needs to be rolled up together so that people understand that the deep state is actually a lot less deep and exciting than they think it is, and is actually just, the cogs of bureaucracy turning. Anyway, I will stop now.
Cory, I want to do a quick follow-up on that. There are some institutions that are evaluating these types of incentives on social platforms to promote outrage. I'm thinking of the algorithm review board that's been proposed in Australia. Do you think something like that would ever work here in the US?
So there's this truism that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product, and that's what causes them to make these things bad. And I think that if that were true, if paying for the product made the companies treat you well, then the farmers who are buying 600,000 John Deere tractors wouldn't be corralled into only using John Deere repair services for their tractors as John Deere fights right to repair across America, right? That actually what lets companies get away with bad conduct is when you don't have a choice. If you don't have a choice, you're the product irrespective of whether you're paying. Fixing algorithms requires not merely that we know what they do, but that we have a choice of going somewhere else. That whether you are a group of individuals who hire a toolsmith to make something that suits your needs better, or whether you are a toolsmith yourself who can do it, or whether you are a firm that wishes to enter the market, the having a spectrum of choices is as important as knowing what the choices reflect. And a lot of what we try to get out of algorithm review, we could get at with just straight up consumer harm standards or fraud standards, where we say, you have to tell us what the algorithm does. And if you're lying, we have a right of action against you. And that way we could make some choices in the world. And we wouldn't be in this kind of Lily Tomlin sketch. We don't have to care we're the phone company. The companies would actually have to worry about losing customers. I mean, Facebook lost 18 million 15 to 34-year-olds in 2018, but they all went to Instagram. So what is the point of knowing how Facebook's algorithm works if the exodus of people who are dissatisfied with the algorithm go to another Facebook property, and not only another Facebook property, a Facebook property that when they acquired it, they promised the EU that they wouldn't mine its data and mix it with Facebook data, a promise that they broke and lied and continue to get away with.
I want to come back to sort of the Facebook frenzy, because that's a big part of what we're talking about with disinformation and journalism. But I want to kick it to Jay really fast. Jay, we have the debates tonight. Obviously, we saw last debate was complete chaos. What is your advice to the news media on covering tonight's debate and future debates, given that the precedent that's been set is not a pretty one?
Well, trying to run a debate with Donald Trump is a unique problem. I'm not sure it's going to repeat itself exactly with Mike Pence right now. But I think what's missing in this system is that the questions journalists ask about don't necessarily come from any understanding of what people want to know about. And I would like to see election coverage overhauled completely so that it begins not with the candidates and their maneuvering or with the horse race and the probability of one horse beating another, but with an inquiry that begins with voters. So I think election coverage should start with a massive attempt by each media property that covers the election to ask the people that it's trying to inform, what do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? What do you want the candidates to be talking about as they compete for votes? And out of knowing that, you develop an agenda for the campaign, which would also be an agenda for asking questions at the debate. So I think that's the disconnect that I think we're likely to see. But this, because of the nature of Trump as a disruptive political actor who is norm busting, doesn't care if he is embarrassed, cannot be shamed, doesn't care about a factual record, doesn't care about a common world of truth. And because Pence is sort of representing that, it's could be wild, just like the first one was wild.
Jay, I have a follow-up question for you, and then I have two more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap. And Jay, my follow-up question is this. We've done studies where we ask people, what is the news that you care about? What is the news that you want to know about? And then we measure what they actually click, what they actually watch. And unfortunately, what people actually consume is so vastly different than what they say they want. They say they want more information about climate, but they're only consuming information about weather. So how do news companies cross this problem?
Well, it's an old problem. Many of the things we've discussed in this panel go back actually to 1920s, the debate between Walter Lippmann and John Dewey about how do you create an actual public. But what you don't do, the thing that you don't do is throw your hands up in the air and say, people are hypocrites. They say this, but they really do that. Let's exploit them because they're hypocrites. I think we have to figure out how the important news things that when they say, I want to know about this, it's not like they're lying. It's like the news system, the media system isn't giving them enough help in pursuing what their better instincts are. And so that's the answer, is not to denounce people as hypocrites and say how funny they are and chuckle about the irony of citizens saying one thing but doing another. It's to improve the news system so that what really matters to their lives is compelling. And as I said, that's a debate that goes back a century or how to do that. But we're still sort of stuck on that. But we have a worse problem because of all the algorithm factors that we've discussed today.
I've never heard it contextualized like that. You might have this dichotomy, but don't exploit it. I think that's really smart. I want to bring a question to Nina and a question to Cory, and they're both audience questions. So thank you so much to those who submitted the audience questions. For Nina, we saw that Facebook just kind of nuked out QAnon accounts. You know, Twitter has just said that people can't talk about Trump dying of COVID. They've also been taking more action on Donald Trump's accounts. Do you see this as a sign that the tech platforms are improving and getting better? And do you worry that they ever are going to get to a place where they're overreaching, they're overcompensating, and then they're going to have even more of a big speech cry problem from conservatives especially, but from other people who think that they're being silenced?
Yeah, you know, I think we are seeing the gradual relenting of the tech platforms. That being said, I think the actions that have been taken so far are basically just window dressing. This QAnon crackdown is a bigger crackdown than we've seen before. They've seemed pretty relentless about it. But we also know that the Q community in general is very, very good at rebranding and dog whistling. And I would not doubt that there is going to be some sort of content that is Q adjacent. They learn how to talk around it and they continue to exist on the platform. Plus, we've seen some worrisome adjustments, like Facebook, for instance, recommending more content from public groups they just announced that they're going to do. And I've done a lot of research into groups and how they incentivize extremism. So I'm pretty worried about that. And on the Twitter side of things, clearly these policies aren't being applied consistently across the board. It's really nice that, you know, they want to crack down on people who wish the president ill. But as someone who has undergone a lot of trolling, and trolling is actually demeaning of what it is, it's abuse and harassment. I don't get any of my, you know, the horrible things I see that are sent to me in my feed. They're not getting any action taken on them. So I think we need a holistic rethinking of how that works. Am I worried that the platforms are going to over moderate? Absolutely. In countries that have, you know, had pretty stringent anti-fake news laws, what we've seen is the mass removal of content that I think is anti-democratic and anti-free speech. So I think that's where we need to be really careful about the regulations that we put into place and make sure that at their core, they are respecting human rights and the values that our democracy is built on. Right now, we've been abdicating that responsibility. Again, as we politicize this discussion and make it more about conservative versus liberal, it instead should be about protecting voices across the spectrum.
I agree with that, and we're starting to see some of that over censorship happen in, quite frankly, some democracies that are slipping, Turkey, et cetera. So I think that can be a huge problem. Cory, let's round out with you. We had a question from the audience, and this is a little wonky, so if you don't mind just kind of simplifying it for us, on what we think is going to happen with Section 230. You see the president tweeting every few days, repeal Section 230. And for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a legal protection that allows big tech platforms like Facebook and Twitter to not be responsible for the things that happen.
Nope.
What do you think is going to go down?
That's not what 230 is. 230 is a rule that says that what you write. Okay, so CDA 230 says that what you do Oh no. Hello?
Hey, can you hear us?
I can. Oh my goodness. What a piece of amazing timing.
All right, you
Can
were just
hear me?
telling me that I was wrong on 230.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So 230 is a law that says that what you say you're legally responsible for, what other people platform you're not legally responsible for unless it's a crime, in which case you have to take it down. And there isn't a newspaper comment section in the world that could survive if 230 were blown up. There would be no hosting for Black Lives Matter if 230 were blown. It would be inconceivable that we could have a kind of robust discourse if we said to risk-averse massive corporations, you have to somehow decide a priori whether the speakers on your platform are breaking the law, and if so, you have to block their speech. We can't even figure out how to do that well with copyright enforcement, and we at least have a kind of vague idea of what is and isn't a copyrighted work. To know what is or isn't an actionable statement is effectively impossible. The idea that there's like a distinction between publisher and platform appears nowhere in 230. It's a fiction made up by right-wing operatives who want to make it illegal to kick Nazis off their platform. And I despair when I hear people who I think of as otherwise sensible people say, Mark Zuckerberg is really terrible at moderation. Why don't we make him do more of it? And if he gets it wrong, fine him, and then hope that he doesn't block all of the people we agree with who have ideas that tend to be heterodox in the mainstream discourse.
Okay, so just to wrap, what do you think is going to happen? You think there's going to be movement on it or no?
I think that it's quite possible. I think that there's a bunch of people, just like with Sesta Fosta, which was the rule that was supposed to prevent sex trafficking and instead reinvigorated the dying trade of pimping and put sex workers at enormous personal risk while doing nothing to stop sex trafficking, that there are a bunch of well-meaning people who don't understand the technology very well, who are going to get taken in by right-wing talking points and by their rage at the tech platforms, which is a completely justifiable rage. And what they're going to do is give the tech platforms a kind of regulatory gift, right? They're going to say, right, the price of admission for hosting a platform for speech is to have millions and millions of dollars to moderate everything your users say. And by an incredible coincidence, there's only like 5 companies that have all that money, and it does not punish them to make it illegal to compete with them.
All right, whew, we've gotten through a lot today. I want to thank the folks at the NYC Media Lab. Thank you so much to Hazel and Kate and to Steve for making this possible. Remember, Build the Future 2020 is the hashtag to continue participating. I want to thank our panelists, Cory, Jay, and Nina, for a really enlightening conversation. I think Jay said something that was really enlightening, which is a lot of these are not new problems, but we need new solutions. So thank you all so much for joining, and we'll see you soon.